In our last video for this unit, we're going to take another look at some of the deductive reasoning or logic laws from the last video, but we're going to look at some special cases for these, some ways that we might apply those patterns, but the sentences might be a little bit jumbled. I also want to take a quick look reminding you of some of our other validity that we can figure out. So talking a little bit more about our contrapositive statements and do a couple more examples on finding a counterexample, because I know that's been tricky for people. So first, let's look at some deductive reasoning applications. So you'll notice I have a few examples on here. On the left-hand side, I have statements that we used in our previous video, or similar to our previous video, like our first one. And so I want to show you what's another way that you could see this written that it would still make a valid argument. So our first example, if the street is flooded, then you'll need a boat to school. So again, I always like mapping these out. I don't know about you, but when I see all these words kind of mushed together, it's hard for me to figure out what the order is. I can see the order a little bit better when I translate it into symbols. So you don't need to do that, but if it helps, do it. Okay, so if the street is flooded, then you'll need a boat to get to school. Okay, so that's basically if P, then Q. Your street is flooded. It's a repeated idea from the first idea in the sentence. So that's our P statement. You'll need a boat to get to school. Well, wait a second. That's the same idea that we already labeled as kind of our Q statement. So this is definitely a valid argument. Technically, this is our detachment. And this is indeed a valid argument that we can make on this. So another version that we could see of this is look at the alternate version on the right-hand side. So another way that you could see this, and it still makes a valid conclusion with that statement 3, is start with your street is flooded, and then your second sentence says, if the street is flooded, then you need a boat to get to school. So if I look at the order and I do my labels, well, we already labeled your street is flooded. That was our P statement before. If the street is flooded, then you'll need a boat to get to school. Well, we label that as if P, then Q. And while this doesn't perfectly look like law of detachment, what would happen if you just read those two statements in the other order? So if you just flip-flop those two statements, you kept 3 where it is, and that's, we labeled that as Q. So if you flip-flop these, then it actually fits your law of detachment. And so that's one of the biggest tricks that might get played on you, especially if you need to take the SOL or once we get to doing any benchmark assessments. That's one of the tricks they like to pull, is flipping those first 2 ideas, but keeping the conclusion, keeping statement 3 in the same order. So if you can read those first 2 statements in the other order and it still fits with one of the patterns we looked at, then it is still a valid conclusion with that 3rd statement. So even though they're flip-flopped, it still works with that law. Okay, let's look at the next one. Again, this is taken right out of our examples from last lesson. Okay, if it does not rain, then I will walk to school. Okay, 2 ideas. If it doesn't rain, I'll walk to school. If P, then Q. If I walk to school, then I'll wear my hiking boots. Okay, well, walk to school was a repeat. I labeled that as Q. I'll wear my hiking boots. New idea, let's label that as R. So therefore, that's one of those we're repeating in the middle. So which law is this going to be? That's going to be law of syllogism. So if we write out our valid conclusion, we're going to want to go with if P, then R, or if we write it out, that'll be therefore, if, and I'm going to abbreviate, if it doesn't rain, then I'm going to wear my hiking boots. We can still come to a valid conclusion. So again, that was one of our examples from the last video. So a way that we could do this alternately, again, read the alternate version and see what I changed. So if I walk to school, then I'll wear my hiking boots. Wait a second, that's the same thing that was in the second sentence before. If it does not rain, then I'll walk to school. What is it? Same thing. These are exactly the same 2 statements as we have in this first example on the left-hand side. They're just reversed from each other. They're flip-flopped. Well, if I just read them in that different order, read statement 2 first. So if it does not rain, then I'll walk to school. if I walk to school, then I'll wear my hiking boots. It's exactly the same thing as the example from before. So I can actually use exactly the same idea for my conclusion. I can come to the same conclusion on it. So I can actually, using the power of technology, I'm going to take this and I'm going to, actually I don't have a way to copy that, so I'm going to have to just write that out. That's okay. So therefore, let me go back to the pen tool. So therefore, if it doesn't rain, then I'll wear my hiking boots. So again, all we did is read those two first sentences in the other order. Okay, go ahead and pause and try out this last example. Again, it starts out same exact example as we had from our previous video, and then look at how it changed on the alternate version. Try to come up with a conclusion for both of these. Okay, so if you look at the first example from lesson 1D, if you eat a good breakfast, then you won't be hungry till lunch. So if P, then Q. Second statement, you were very hungry after first block. So the way we did this last time was we called that negative or negated Q because it really is opposite from that main idea, but very closely related to that first sentence. So again, this is following our law of contrapositive. So it is definitely still we can still make a valid conclusion on this. So our conclusion would be therefore not P, excuse me. So therefore not P. So to write this out, so therefore I didn't eat a good breakfast. I'm going to abbreviate a little bit. I didn't eat breakfast. We can come to exactly the same conclusion on the alternate version. The only difference is they flip-flop those first two statements. So if I read those in reverse order, if you eat a good breakfast, then you won't be hungry till lunch. You were very hungry after first block. It's exactly the same as the previous example. So we can still use the same conclusion. So therefore, I didn't eat a good breakfast. Therefore, I didn't eat breakfast. Okay. So moral of the story is if they give you 3 statements and ask you, is the third statement a valid conclusion? Or if they just give you 2 statements and you don't think they quite match the pattern, try just reading them in a different order and see if that means that you can fit one of the patterns better. Right, again, you're not going to see too many of those, but they will occasionally pop up. So now let's look at a couple of review problems. And again, this is going to go back to talking about how do we know if a statement is true. And so we're going to look at contrapositive statements and what happens when we need to determine their validity. So this kind of goes back to what we talked about when we were doing our logic laws. So we have a law of contrapositive, which states if we're given a conditional statement, then we start the contrapositive. We can then form a conclusion of the rest of our contrapositive statement. So as a reminder, that was if P then Q. They gave us not Q, then our conclusion, therefore, will be not P. And so don't forget, we can kind of almost translate this just into being able to figure out whether a contrapositive statement is true. So our first example in A, our conditional is, if it is the end of a unit, then we have an assessment. And that's going to be true for in most of your classes. You might have a test in most cases, you might have a project, you might have a paper, but you have something to assess your knowledge at the end. So let's write the contrapositive to that. So contrapositive, again, don't forget, you switch the order of your ideas and you negate both of them. So flip the ideas, we need to start with an assessment, but then negate it. So if we don't have an assessment, I'm going to abbreviate as assess because I know that's a long word, then it is the end of a unit. And so let's look at our validity, whether these are true or false. So if it is the end of the unit, then we have an assessment. Well, in most cases, that's going to be true. We're going to have, some form of assessment, again, not always a test, but something for your teachers to measure. Hey, did you understand the material in this unit? And do we need to go back and review anything? Or, to let you know, hey, I need to ask questions about these topics. So I'm going to say that's a true statement. So if we don't have an assessment, then it is, oops, I put in a typo there, didn't I? What did I forget to do? Yeah, I forgot to negate that last piece. So let's fix that. So then it isn't the end of a unit. Well, if we don't have an assessment, then it isn't the end of a unit. Well, I would count that as true, because if we're thinking about it, well, it's not the end of I don't have any kind of assessment. Well, it's not going to be kind of the end of our unit or the end of whatever we're looking at. So that is also a true statement. Now, we could still have assessments randomly through the unit. You're doing a lesson check at the end of almost every lesson. That's still technically an assessment. And you could think of it, well, it's the end of that lesson, but they're not mutually exclusive. Okay, example B. If I am tired, then I didn't sleep enough last night. Well, can you be tired even if you did sleep enough? Well, yeah, you might be, sick, you might have a cold, your body might just need more sleep than you usually do. So I'm going to say that statement is false. So let's write the contrapositive again, switch and flip. So if I slept enough last night, then I am not tired. So the typical teenager needs at least 8 to 9 hours of sleep. You slept the regular amount, so if you slept enough, then could you still be tired? Well, yeah, what if you got up and went for a run in the morning? You might be tired afterwards. So same truth value as the first statement. So again, contrapositive statements are always going to have the same truth value as the conditional that you started with. And that follows right from our law of contrapositive law that we looked at in our last lesson. Okay, reminder of counterexamples. These are examples, again, that prove a statement false. So we looked at this in lesson 1C. Just wanted to make sure we came back to it real quick. So example C, all prime numbers are odd. So what's a prime number? And so it's any number that is divisible by only itself or 1. It doesn't have any other factors, no other values that it can be, nicely divided by. So can you think of any numbers that are prime that aren't odd? Well, think about really small numbers. What about 2? 2 is prime because we can only divide it by 1 or 2. Otherwise, we're going to get a fraction or a rational number. So there's our counterexample. 2 is a prime number, but technically considered even because it is divisible by 2 itself. Okay, D, all shapes that have 4 sides are squares. So counterexample, can you think of any shapes that have 4 sides that aren't squares? Well, we're going to look at this a lot more in our quadrilaterals unit, but you could think of, what about a parallelogram? Or a trapezoid? Or even just go with something more simple, a rectangle. So technically, we're going to talk about, kind of some overlap in our categories, but if it's a trapezoid, then it doesn't have all the properties the square needs. Same thing as a rectangle. The typical rectangle does not have all the properties a square needs. Alrighty, as always, let us know if you have any questions on this topic. Otherwise, get started on your practice and, let me know if you get to, any stopping points or places where you need to ask a question. Have a great rest of your lesson and day.